Welcome, everybody. This is, as you see on your screen, a advocate training session on the geometry of street transformations. My name is Garrett Hennigan. I'm a community organizer with WABA and have been working on advocating for better, safer streets and better places to bike for at least 6 years now. And I'm really excited to see all of you and share some of the sort of quick skills. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through a few things. This is one session of many that we're doing. So if you like what you see here, please do check out the rest of our calendar, which I'll share at the end. All of these are sort of a la carte trainings on topics and sort of tools and soft skills that might interest you that can all help us become better advocates. All right, before we start, wanted to go through just a few things. As I mentioned, this session will be recorded so that it's available afterwards. Now is a good time to take a look at the bottom of your screen and find your mic, find the chat box, and also find your mute button. I will ask that you all keep yourselves muted unless you're talking. And we will actually have a substantial question and answer section at the end, as well as a group activity. And I'll be stopping along the way to answer any questions that folks might have. But if you do have a question, feel free to either drop it in the chat or save it till the end. Let's see, I wanted to point your attention to, we have going to be sharing the slides, both to you as you can see now, but you can also follow along the Google Slides if you like. And we also have a shared notes handout, which you should feel free to take some notes in, or that'll also be very useful for our group activity coming up soon. And I should also say, I apologize if there's any noise in the background. I have some very musical housemates who cannot be stopped. Okay, yeah, so if you all would, go ahead and find that chat icon. And if you would just take a moment to share your name, what neighborhood you live in, and also, yeah, your city, your county, just so we have a sense of who all is here. Again, we'll give everyone a chance to actually speak up and talk to each other a little bit later. All right, great. Thanks so much for joining us. Okay, so let's get right into it. Today we are talking about street transformations and especially the geometry of them. How it all adds up into better streets. More people are biking in the DC region than really ever before, or at least in any decade before. In DC, by last count, 5% of people were commuting by bike to work, 2.5% in Arlington, and quite a bit less in the other counties and cities. But that puts DC at least at number 2 in terms of bike mode share for any city in the United States, which is pretty great. A big part of that is that we've definitely seen a culture change. A lot of people are looking to biking and they see it's great. And especially that is happening right now during this absurd pandemic. But another big piece is that the city's been investing a lot in changing the way that our streets are designed. So those two go hand in hand. What you're seeing right here, that this was actually taken during Open Streets Day on Georgia Avenue. It's hard, it was a beautiful day, but it's hard to imagine a little tyke getting out and riding in the middle of the road today because of how it was designed. So a big way of how we are gonna get more people on bikes is to redesign our roads. Now, when we talk about redesigning our roads, it's important to recognize that stress tolerance plays a huge role in growing more, or understanding stress tolerance plays a huge role in getting more people biking. This is a helpful chart that we like to look through, remind people of from time to time, as I said, in DC, we're at 5% of people regularly biking to work. And that shows, I think, that given the streets that we've built, we are just scratching the surface of what is possible. Almost 60% of people are interested but concerned. And the reality is that to get those people out on bikes and to get them taking trips by bike regularly, we need to change the way that we're designing our streets to separate them more from traffic and to offer a truly low stress experience. You'll often hear people talk about designing a street for all ages and abilities, meaning like 8 years old to 80 years old, feeling comfortable there. So understanding the stress of a street is really critical. We do have a sense of sort of what that stress map looks like. This is from a study done, I think, in 2017 of DC. What you're seeing on the screen is all of those lines are streets in DC that are already low stress because they're low traffic, they're low speed, and more or less they're a good place to bike. That's 50% of all streets in DC. But what you may also notice is that that's almost none of the major streets, those main streets that actually connect our neighborhoods together. So while we have a lot of low stress streets, it doesn't form a very useful network. If you're trying to get somewhere instead of just riding around in circles, you're going to end up on a pretty stressful street. And for people who are not tolerant of stress, which is, again, most people, they're going to look at that most stressful moment in their potential bike ride. And if it doesn't suit them, they're going to say, nope, it's not worth it. I'm just not going to try that. And especially that there are very difficult places for this, bridges, highways, and sort of high vehicle roads that divide our communities. Some of those streets are easier to transform than others. Okay. So we're talking about street transformations. Before we get into the sort of geometry of it, what fits where and what can fit, it's important to first understand at a very high level how cities actually rebuild streets, how they redesign them and make changes to them. And for the most part, those fit into 3 general categories, which I've listed here. So at the top is sort of routine maintenance. This is filling potholes. This is restriping crosswalks that were already there, or restriping bike lanes that were already there. These are sort of day-to-day maintenance tasks. They don't cost a huge amount, and they don't take all that much time to carry out. Quite often, these things are handled through like a city's 311 system. You report a pothole, and within a couple of days to a week to a couple of weeks, it's repaired. But not major changes are not happening at this level. Taking a step down the tree, we have projects that are sort of restriping or repaving. This is, for instance, most cities and counties, they'll repave their local roads every 5 to 10 years. And when repaving a road, you have to restripe it afterwards. That's a really good opportunity to ask the question, could we put it back in a different way? Very often the answer is yes, if you're asking the question. Unfortunately, a lot of times things are just on autopilot and they put it back exactly how it was before. But this is a big opportunity for us. Restriping and repaving, it costs a bit more. It also requires a bit more planning, maybe some engineering work. It may require some public input to get a sense of what the community's values are for that street and how different changes might play out. So that takes a little longer. Sort of changing streets by restriping or repaving can take from a couple of months to, in many cases, a couple of years. But that's an area where we spend a lot of time working because it's relatively fast. The third category is major road reconstruction. These are expensive projects. We're not talking real numbers here, but very, very expensive compared to the other two. Planning and engineering and public outreach for these major reconstructions takes years and years and years. Very often your timeline is 5 years to even 10 years. Think, completely rebuilding a place. On your screen here is actually, this is Beach Drive that goes through the middle of DC. And over the course of 3 years, this road was rebuilt. They went all the way down to the sub foundation of it and rebuilt it from the ground up. The planning for this, however, took about a decade. So these things take forever. So those are sort of the 3 main categories that we're working with. I want to note, of course, that we're not talking about, in this case, emergency actions to create slow streets or healthy streets or open streets, as you may have seen in other communities. WABA is actively working on doing some of those actions, getting cities to take some of those actions with varying success around the region. We have a petition if you'd like to support that. You can check it out on waba.org. But when we're talking about changing streets permanently, it falls into one of these 3 categories. With that in mind, when we're talking about what can be done in the short term, what can be done inexpensively, we are looking at that middle restriping or repaving category. And necessarily, you see in this photo, there are brand new curbs being built on that road. Anytime that we're moving curbs, it's almost always going to be a major reconstruction, which means it takes a very, very long time. It's very expensive, etc. So that means that if we want to transform our streets, we need to be thinking very carefully about how we can use the existing space between the existing curbs. How can we use the existing asphalt to move people around differently, to create safer streets, to create less stressful streets for biking and also walking. Okay, so you might be thinking to yourself like, yeah, okay, but what does this actually look like on real streets? Here is not a real street, but an example of a street. So our cities and counties really need to be more creative about the space that we already have. In most places, pictured like this one pictured, you have buildings. You can't just go widening roads, both because it's very expensive, it takes a very long time, but also there may be buildings in the way or private residences. So just expanding out is not practical and certainly isn't quick. But we can be much better about working with what we have and working with the streets that we have today. You can just throw down a new line of paint and dramatically change the way that people use a street. So getting a little more into the geometry of things, we are looking today at the space between the curbs. This is sort of the curb to curb width or curb to curb distance. All right, I'm just catching up with, thank you, Jason. That's a very good question, or sorry, a very good point about striping. Different communities, it's a different timeline. But we're focused on what can we fit between the curbs. Kind of put your blinders on, try to ignore what's happening outside of those curbs, try to ignore, if you can, the very narrow sidewalks. And let's just think about what we can do between those. And that's sort of what the focus of our next few minutes will be. Before we get to that, I wanted to just quickly pause. Oh, no, we'll get to questions in just a minute. Okay, so the question is, what can we do with that space, right? How do we actually change a street? The example I just showed you, all of that space is already divvied up. There's plenty of car lanes. What can we do with it? One thing we can do with it is doing something called a road diet. This is a handy animation that shows what one of those could look like. The fact is that roads can carry far more people with fewer travel lanes. In fact, often they can carry far more cars with fewer travel lanes, which is sort of paradoxical, but true. Very often, eliminating a car lane creates more space for biking and walking. And so this is a great tactic we should be looking at. What you're seeing here, this is a classic 4-to-3 road diet. There are other ways that this can be achieved. Here's sort of another example of a road diet on a one-way street. So this animation, I think, makes it pretty clear. You take the existing space that's mostly devoted to cars, you squeeze it down. Maybe you squeeze down the travel lane, squeeze down the parking lane, and suddenly you have all of this extra width to put in, bike lanes or protected bike lanes or whatever you're looking for. So road diets are a really fantastic way to work with our streets. Another option is something called a lane diet, which is sort of a similar idea. More space than necessary is devoted to moving cars. And if we just squeeze things down a little bit, we can find some more space for, say, bike lanes. Another reason that this is a good idea is that many car lanes are just far wider than they should be. And wider lanes very often leads to more speeding. There's some evidence, quite a bit of evidence that suggests that wider lanes makes drivers feel more comfortable at traveling at higher speeds. So wider lanes gives you higher speeds. So just squeeze them down and you get a street that can potentially work for everybody, or at least work for more people. So lane diets and road diets are really quite terrific. I want to pause there and just see if there are any questions on that topic. Obviously, we're going to go into much more detail. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and just unmute yourself. And I'll wait just a few moments. Okay, great. We are all on the same page. Okay, so we have a sense of like road diets, lane diets, squeezing things down, right? But we can't just go start squeezing things down willy-nilly, right? Otherwise, we might find some unintended consequences. So how much can we actually squeeze things? What are the limits? Where do we want to stop? What you all probably know that you have sort of felt, but maybe never really recognized, is that the design of a space, the amount of space that we allocate to moving different people or different modes actually dramatically changes the way that people use it. So the amount of space might determine the volume of users that can get through, either the number of cars that can get through in a given moment, or the number of people on bikes or people on foot. It can determine what a comfortable speed is, whether you actually feel comfortable going at a reasonable speed, or if it's just too cramped in. The amount of space we allocate absolutely contributes to the level of traffic stress. So if there's no safe place to bike, if there's no space given over whatsoever, it probably won't feel safe. And also, like, a very narrow bike lane next to a very car-dominated street probably doesn't feel safe either. And that amount of space also determines who can use it. Different formats of bicycles, different sizes of bikes, and also different sizes of vehicles. On sidewalks, for instance, this is the reason that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and all sidewalks are a minimum of 5 feet wide, so that somebody using a wheelchair can actually pass by. Now, these aren't just arbitrary standards. For the most part, they're set by engineering. Well, they're set by various government and engineer groups, which you don't need to be familiar with. But we will look at just a few. And then we'll get on to an activity. Okay, so first up, with those road diets and lane diets, the thing that we did first was we squeezed down some driving lanes, and we squeezed down some parking lanes. There are many advocates who would say, well, just get rid of all of them. Streets should just be for walking and biking. I don't disagree with that, but very often other people in the room do. So it's good to know what the rules are that they're working with. Driving lanes, I have here a picture of the Capitol Beltway, because very often they're way wider than they need to be. giving a person behind the wheel a perspective of like, gee, I could be driving at highway speeds right now. But really, a driving lane doesn't have to be wider than 10 feet. There are some exceptions in DC where I think Wisconsin Avenue going down to Georgetown, they're actually 9 feet wide. But for the most part, the standards and all the engineers will tell you 10 feet is good. Most typically around the city, you'll see 11 feet or 12 feet, but a lot of 10-foot wide lanes. If it's a route with buses on it or with heavy truck traffic, sometimes the planners will insist on 11 feet for buses, gives them a little more maneuverability room. But 10 feet is usually sufficient. For those parking lanes, really, for space that's just going to be used to store a car, where it's not going to be moving much, 7 feet is perfectly sufficient, right? But typically you'll see 8 feet, and for larger vehicles, if it's a bus loading zone, if it's another kind of loading zone for commercial use, you might see wider. But 10-foot driving lanes, 7-8-foot parking lanes, perfectly good. Now let's get on to the actual interesting stuff that we're here for. Let's talk bike lanes. So right here you have a couple of years old protected bike lane in Silver Spring. It's about 5 feet wide, the distance, the area that you can actually bike on. And in this context, it looks great. It looks huge. There's tons of room to maneuver. But if we change the context and we add a few more people in, suddenly that 5 foot wide bike lane with a buffer between the lane and the cars actually looks pretty narrow. With all of these people, you'll note that they may look comfortable enough, but there's not enough room to pass each other. There's not enough room for people to ride side by side and carry on a conversation. And also, if there's a lot of debris in the bike lane, rocks or leaves or some glass, it doesn't leave a lot of room to maneuver around. So context is really key in how much space we give to bike lanes and how great they'll be. So with that in mind, here's a couple of those standards. Protected bike lanes typically come in 2 flavors. You have one-way protected bike lanes, where you have a bike lane on each side of the street against the curb. Or you'll see 2-way protected bike lanes, where you have both directions on one side of the street. In both of those configurations, they'll have a buffer between the bike lane, the rideable area, and the cars. To go back to this previous example, these are parked cars on the right side. That white painted area with the posts in it, we call that the buffer. And then the bike lane is actually the distance between the buffer to the curb. So to make these work really well, the sort of standards today say that, well, context matters. How many people are going to be using this? If it's really not that many, just like 150 people during peak hour, which is a steady flow, but not constant, 6.5 feet is great. And you can maybe, and if you really need to, get it down to 5 feet. But if it's quite a lot more people, you want to give people more space. I think people who know DC's protected bike lanes, 15th Street is regularly getting more than 300 bicyclists in the peak hour, and things get very busy. You want that space to maneuver. But these are the numbers for one-way protected bike lanes. Now for 2-ways, we want to get more space, right? So once again, a minimum of sort of 8 feet, and ideally getting up to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 feet. So more space gives more people more room to breathe. They can pass each other safely. They can ride side by side potentially. Families with kids can sort of keep everyone together a little bit better. And you'll see a lot of disagreement about exactly what the best numbers are here for width and space, but I would say stick with these. The state of the practice has been changing quite a lot. We should talk about regular bike lanes as well, because there's still plenty of places where those are appropriate. There's a picture here of buffered bike lanes. So that's a typical painted bike lane, but with a little extra buffer between the lane and car traffic. So there, your minimum is 5 feet. We really don't want to go below that. But typically, we aim for like 6 feet, 6.5 feet. And a buffered bike lane would be just that plus a buffer, which shouldn't be any narrower than 2 feet, but the sky is the limit. Typically, you'll see 3, 4, or 5 feet separating a bike lane from the car traffic. All right. Now, yeah, before jumping on, I want to pause again just to see if anyone has any questions on that. I have summarized this helpfully in the handout and the shared notes, which I put into the chat. All right. Any questions on that before we jump ahead? Great. Well, now we're going to get to the fun part.
Hey, Garrett, you're getting a couple questions in the chat.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much. Okay, one of the question, with everything equal, what is preferred, one-way or two-way? That's a fantastic question. And I will, as I'm saying this, grab the link again. So I'd say all things equal. We're seeing some small, but I think important safety differences between one-way and two-way protected bike lanes, especially a two-way protected bike lane on a two-way street. You get a lot of turning conflicts, and there's some evidence that shows that there are higher crash rates on those. But it really depends. It depends on a lot of factors. And I would rather, that's a topic for a whole nother session. And in fact, the Federal Highways Administration has a wonderful resource all about that, on selecting the right bikeway for the right street. And I'll happily point that out at the end. Okay, a question about dooring. Looking at what we're looking at here. For those who aren't familiar with it, with a typical bike lane that's right next to a parking lane, typically there's an area we would call the door zone, where a door could open and, if it happens quickly, potentially hit a bicyclist and knock him off the bike. It's a very serious injury cause for crashes. And so typically next to a parking lane, you do want a much wider bike lane. A 5-foot bike lane is not going to be enough. So 6.5. Sometimes you'll even see a sort of a modification of this kind of buffered bike lane, which puts a buffer between the bike lane and the car. Protected bike lanes are a much better case for that. Okay, and we'll have plenty of time at the end. I want to make sure to keep on rolling. Okay, so let's actually play around with this sort of geometry of street design. We have, I showed you earlier a handy graphic from a tool that we love to use called Street Mix. It is free, it is available online, and it's super easy to use. And actually, I'm going to walk you through it real quick. Sort of a good way of taking a look at a street and asking the question, you know, how could we redesign this? What could we put here? And yeah, so I'll show you real quick just sort of what Street Mix is all about, and then we're actually going to do a small group activity to take a look at some of the streets around the region and play around with alternatives. So if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I will get this loaded up. You can play along at home if you like. And it's not streetmix.com, it's streetmix.net. Okay. There we go. I'll just give you a very quick orientation of what we're looking at here. Let me switch my screen over there. Okay. Great. And so now you all should be seeing Street Mix, which is basically, imagine if you were just sitting in the middle of a street and looking down. You get sort of a nice cross section of what's happening on the street. You can name this street if you like, but you don't have to. Up here at the top are some important controls. You have the street width. This is actually where you set the building to building width. But again, we are most often focused on the curb to the curb. All of the elements here on a street, you can actually move around any way you like. So you can rearrange things, just grab and drop. You can hover your mouse over them and you can remove them. You can make them narrower. You can make them wider. With some cases, you can change the direction of it. For bike lanes, you can change the color, or you can remove them entirely. You'll notice down on the bottom here, you can pick out different street elements and add them to your street. And we have quite a lot of options here. But you can grab a driving lane. You can change some of the design. You can throw some sharrows in, not that they really change much. You can make a more realistic rendering showing all the trucks that come through there. And again, you can make these nice and wide. You can make these nice and narrow. Street Mix helpfully shows down here a little sense, gives you a sense of what that lane will actually do in terms of throughput. Bike lanes move a lot of people. Sidewalks move a lot of people. Driving lanes, not so much. And so once you'll also notice that depending on the width that you've set here, it'll give you a helpful sort of reminder if you've gone too wide. Once you found a street that once you found a design that you really like, you can actually save these, and you can share them. So up in the share menu, you can copy a URL to easily share with somebody. You can save an image, so just you can click that and easily share. You can customize it a little bit with different settings and download that for sharing later. And you can also take that, let's say you start with a street how it is today, you can hit New Street, and it'll actually give you the option. It'll create a new copy of it, and it will give you the option of, there we are, starting with a brand new street, start with a completely empty street, or actually start with the street that you just finished with, to sort of create many, many iterations of the same thing. So this is a really simple but quite powerful tool of taking a single block, sort of mid block, and thinking about how we could repurpose the space. The example I have right here is not very pretty. And it also quite helpfully saves everything that you've done in the past so that you can go back and retrieve them. It's a very, very handy tool. So that is Street Mix, and in just a moment, we're actually going to spend some time as a group getting into it. All right, I think we're back to my screen there. Yes. Okay, so just to run through, like, quickly, if you're wondering, like, how would we actually go about doing this? It's pretty simple. You want to pick a street first, and often the best way to sort of get a sense of what it's like on the ground is to use Google Maps. Google Maps has a really handy measuring tool where you can get into satellite view and actually measure the distance between 2 points to kind of approximate that curb-to-curb distance. Once you have that and that image on satellite or street view, you can sort of map out what the street looks like today. And then you can save a copy for later and start playing around with different designs, removing, say, parking lanes, removing driving lanes, and exploring with, what you could do with that extra space. Street Mix makes it very, very easy to do things like add tree boxes and expand sidewalks, and add concrete medians and things. I will remind you, though, that Street Mix is, an imaginary tool. So I often like to constrain myself and think about what can we just do with the existing curb to curb, to sort of simulate what a transportation agency could do really quickly. And yeah, so more or less that's it. Once you create some space, good to add bike lanes, play around with the different widths of them, and also don't forget to add that bike lane buffer. To spend a moment actually playing around with this, we're going to do a small group activity. So let's see, we're going to split up into groups and use the Zoom breakout rooms. Looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We're going to do three small groups, and basically each of you is going to do what you see on the screen. You're going to take a look at the shared notes, which are in the chat right now. So we'll have groups 1, 2, and 3, which will be dropped into in just a moment. And your job is to mock up the street that you've been assigned. There's a link to a sort of Google Maps area. So with your group, dive into that, try to mock it up in Street Mix, and play around with, try to find at least 2 different alternatives of like how that street could be redesigned. We'll give you a couple of minutes, and then come back and to report back. Just try to save the URL from that Street Mix into the shared notes, and pick a presenter. It may also be helpful for one person to share their screen, which you can do in the breakout groups. So I will split you all up. If there are any questions, I will duck into those rooms. Thank you all for diving into that activity head first. I know it was a little bit bumpy, as with any new tool, but I hope you got sort of a quick sense of what we can do to play around with this. I know each group ran into the setting like the width of the street, but that is perfectly okay. It was measuring the building to building, and unfortunately there's no setting to set it curb to curb. I'd ask that everybody put the URLs to those streets that you created into that Google document, and I will actually, we can very quickly run through those. So if someone wants to, where did that go? If somebody wants to, I suppose, present, or at least very quickly hop on video and say what y'all did. I can throw up the street that you created. It looks like group number 2 has something. Does someone from group number 2 want to jump in?
We did manage to mimic the street and make a altercation, or rather, whatever, change it. But we were chatting about the slightly unlikelihood that it would change. Although somebody seemed to know that there were bike lanes originally planned for Connecticut.
Okay, so you guys were looking at Connecticut Avenue, just north of DuPont Circle. Yeah. Okay, so it looks like you found some space to squeeze in some bike lanes. How did you make space to do that?
Those were originally two lane for cars, and so we made them 1 lane.
Okay, awesome. You said, you don't need that much space. Let's just do it with less. Love it. And I see that you left some parking for all the merchants there. I'm sure people will appreciate that. We're living in a fantasy land right now, so so such things aren't all that relevant. Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And anything else you wanna add?
I don't think so. I would be curious to hear about the Florida Ave experiment that's been going on. That's been very messy.
Absolutely.
But maybe not for this session. I don't know.
Great. Cool. Does someone from one of the other groups wanna? I see that group 3 has some in. Someone from group 3 wanna jump on? This is Monroe Street Northeast.
Sure. Let's see. Do you want me to share the screen to show it, or
I think you all should see it right now.
Yes. All right. So, looking at the actual street, I think we probably want to reverse everything. I thought it was easy just to move the bus shelter over to fix it. But looking at the actual street, it looks like we've got businesses on one side of the street and pretty much an empty other side of the street. Just is pretty much a building, maybe at the back of a building. It seems almost not much retail. So we probably switched it so the bike lane was on that side. But we took out one lane of parking, used the other lane of parking to give us a buffer to have a two-way lane. Our road wasn't very wide, so we realized we had to kind of give away one lane of parking to make our bike lane happen. And we tried a bike lane on both sides, but realized that the two buffers between the bike lanes and the parked cars were going to put us over the 40 feet. So this is kind of the best solution we've thought.
Awesome. And if we use our imagination outside of those curbs, we have the existing sidewalks and buildings and things. Fantastic. Yeah, and you've managed to put in some very nice, nice wide bike lanes. I suspect that engineers would see these 9-foot driving lanes and have some issues, especially because Monroe gets used by a lot of buses. But I think it's important to start by shooting for the sky, stars, right?
Yeah, we could give a few feet up with the bike lane if we had to.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing. And group 1, did y'all get anywhere you want to share? It's all right if you didn't. Okay. Well, that's all right. We can switch on back and finish right up. We're just coming up on time. But find that. Okay. Just 2 more slides. So that was fantastic. I hope a very quick introduction to StreetMix and what you can do with it, and also some of the numbers and sort of constraints that we're working with. But also a huge opportunity. You know, asphalt is asphalt. We can carve it out from one use and give it to another. If you're looking for more inspiration of how some of these street transformations can happen, there are some really quite readable and at least pretty resources you can sort of leaf through. The National Association of excuse me, City Transportation Officials, NACTO. They have an urban street design guide. They have bikeway design guides, which is full of like pretty pictures of how bikes and bike facilities can be integrated into streets. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation, they have a really revolutionary for the United States design guide for protected bike lanes and protected intersections. If you're interested in the nitty gritty of like, you know, how wide should a bike lane be? How wide should our buffers be? How should it approach intersections? How do we keep, you know, bicyclists and pedestrians interacting safely? This is a great resource, but mostly very pretty pictures. And also Montgomery County, very locally, when they updated their bike master plan in 2018, they created a bicycle facility design guide as well, which features some really good ideas. We talked a lot about protected bike lanes today. There's great guidance in there on what they call neighborhood greenways and other sort of treatments for streets that might not be very stressful, but could use a few changes to make them, you know, more appropriate for low stress biking. So there are links there and also in the notes. Just wanted to quickly preview, you know, the next trainings coming up. Still getting a handle on the timing and the sort of interactive portions, but you can find more of these at waba.org/fun. And finally, if there are questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer them, either about this stuff or other things. But if there are not, I will say thank you all so much for joining. I had a good time. I hope you all did too. But yeah, if there are any questions, happy to dive into them.